Hello, my friends, it's Indiana Holmes, and tonight we finish our novel, A Silent Witness. We have just one chapter left to go. We'll complete that tonight. It'll probably take less than an hour, but when we finish, all will be revealed. This murder mystery will be solved, but will the criminal have been captured? That still remains to be seen. Let's find out together. Okay, so we begin. Chapter 22. Thorndyke reviews the case. When Professor Woodfield, having deliberately packed his bag, and to my great relief and Jervis's, declined Thorndyke's invitation to stay and take tea with us, presently he took his departure. We descended to the sitting room, whither Polton followed us almost immediately with a tea tray, having apparently boiled the kettle in the adjacent workshop while the final act of the analysis was in progress. He placed the tray on a small table by Thorndyke's chair, and evidently anticipating the inevitable discussion on the results of the analysis which would take place, made up the fire on a liberal scale and retired with unconcealed reluctance. As soon as we were alone, Jervis opened the subject by voicing his and my joint desire for more light. "This has been a great surprise to me," Thorndyke said. "A complete surprise?" Thorndyke asked. "No, I can't say that. The solution of the problem was one that I had proposed to myself, but I had rejected it as impossible, and it looks impossible still, though I now know it to be the true solution." "I quite appreciate your difficulty," said Thorndyke, "and I see that if you did not happen to light on the answer to it, the difficulty was insuperable. That is, almost impossible to believe. That was the really brilliant feature in Maddox's plan. But for a single fact, which was almost certainly to be overlooked, the real explanation of the circumstances would appear utterly incredible. Even if suspicion had been aroused later, and the true explanation suggested, there seemed to be one fact with which it was absolutely irreconcilable." "Yes," agreed Jervis. "That is what I have felt. The truth is," said Thorndyke, "that this crime was planned with the most diabolical cleverness and subtlety. We realize that when we consider by what an infinitely narrow margin it failed. Indeed, we can hardly say that it did fail. As far as we can see, it succeeded completely, and if the criminal could only have accepted its success, there seems to be no reason why any discovery should ever have taken place. Looking back on the case, we see that our experience has been the same as O'Donnell's. We had no clue whatsoever, excepting that the one that was furnished by the criminal himself in his unnecessary efforts to obtain even greater security would actually be the thing that led us to the discovery of the crime and the criminal. Suppose Maddox, having carried out his plan successfully, had been content to leave it that. Who would have known, or even suspected, that a crime had been committed? Not a soul, I believe. But instead of that, he needed to do what the criminal almost invariably does. He had to tinker at the crime when all was going well, and surround himself by a number of needless safeguards by which, in the end, attention is attracted to his doings. He knows, or believes he knows, that Jardine has in his possession certain knowledge of a highly dangerous character. He does not ask himself whether Jardine is aware that he possesses such knowledge, but, appraising that knowledge at what he himself knows to be its value, he decides to get rid of Jardine as the one element of danger, and that was where he failed. If he had left Jardine alone, the whole affair would have passed off as perfectly normal, and its details would soon have been lost sight of and forgotten. Even as it was, he missed complete success only by a hair's breadth. But for the most vital, or I should say, not really vital, but for the most trivial coincidence, Jardine's body might be lying undiscovered in that cellar at this very moment. That's a comfortable thought for you, Jardine, my young colleague remarked. Very, I agreed, with a slight shudder at the recollection of that horrible death trap. But what was the coincidence? I never understood how you came to be in that most unlikely place at that very opportune moment. It was the merest chance, replied Thorndyke. I happened to have called in at the hospital that evening, and having an hour to spare, it occurred to me to look in at Batson's and see if you were getting on quite happily in your new command. As I had induced you to take charge, I felt some sort of responsibility in the matter. It was exceedingly kind of you, sir, said I. Not in the least, said Thorndyke. It was really just the ordinary solicitude of the teacher for a promising pupil. Well, when I arrived at the house, I found that excellent girl Maggie standing on the doorstep looking anxiously up and down the street. It seemed that on reflection she was still convinced that the works were unattended, and the oddity of the whole set of circumstances had made her somewhat uneasy. I waited a few minutes and disposed of one or two patients, and then, as you did not return, after what seemed an unaccountably long absence, I very easily induced her to show me where the place was, and when you arrived there, the deserted aspect of the building and the notice board over the gate seemed rather to justify her anxiety. I rang the bell loudly, as I dare say you know, but I did not wait very long. When I failed to get any response, I too became suspicious and proceeded without delay to pick the lock of the wicket, and it's most fortunate that the wicket was unprovided with a bolt, which would have delayed me very considerably. You know the rest. When I shouted your name, you must have tried to answer, for I caught a kind of muffled groan and a sound of tapping, which guided me and Maggie to your prison. But it was a near thing, for when I opened the cellar door, you fell out quite unconscious and accompanied by a gush of carbon dioxide that was absolutely stifling. Yes, said I, it was touch and go. A few minutes more, it would have been all up with me. I realized that as soon as I recovered consciousness, but I couldn't for the life of me understand why anybody should want to murder me, and I am not so very clear on the subject now. I really knew nothing about Maddock. You knew more than anyone else knew, and he thought you knew more than you did, but perhaps it would be instructive to review the case in detail. It would be very instructive to me, said Jervis, for I don't even now see how you managed to bridge over those gaps that stopped me in my attempts to make a hypothesis that covered all of the circumstances. Very well, said Thorndyke. Then we will begin at the beginning. And the beginning for me was the finding of Jardine, as I have described it. Here was a pretty plain case of attempted murder, evidently premeditated and apparently committed by some person who had access to these works. Evidently also conceived and planned with considerable knowledge, skill, and foresight, though with how much foresight I did not realize until I heard Jardine's story. When I had Jardine's account of the affair, I saw that the crime had been planned with quite remarkable ingenuity and judgment. In fact, the circumstances had been so carefully considered and contingencies so well provided for that, but for a single tactical error, the plan would have succeeded. That error was in making the pretended emergency a surgical injury. If the letter to Jardine had stated that the man was in a fit instead of suffering a wound, our friend would have had no need to call at the surgery for appliances, but would have gone straight to the works. And there, in all probability, his body would still be lying, for no one would have known whither he had gone. And even his body had been accidentally discovered, all traces of the means by which he had been killed would probably have been removed. There would have been nothing to show that he had not strayed into the deserted factory and turned on the gas himself. Indeed, it is pretty certain that matters would have been so arranged as to convey the impression to the persons who made the discovery. There was the letter, said I. That would have given things away to some extent. But you wouldn't have had it in your pocket, from which he would, of course, have removed it. We may be sure that he had not overlooked the letter. It was the need for surgical appliances that he had overlooked. But in spite of this error, the plan was ingenious, subtle, and clearly not the work of an ignorant man. And here I would point out to you that this latter fact was one of great importance in searching for the solution of the mystery. We knew something of our man. He was subtle, resourceful, absolutely ruthless. Nothing, or I should say, noting this, I was prepared in pursuing the case to find his other actions characterized by subtlety, resourcefulness, and ruthfulness. His further actions were not going to be those of a dullard or an ignoramus. But this was not all the information that I had concerning the personality of this unknown villain. Jervis and I looked over the cellars, and that same night, within an hour and a half of the rescue, and before anything had been removed, we were then in a position to infer that the unknown was possibly somewhat a tall man of above average strength, as shown by the weight, position, and arrangement of the iron bottles. Moreover, since there was no faintest trace of a fingerprint of any of them, it followed that some precaution against them, such as gloves, had been adopted, which again suggested either a professional criminal or a person well acquainted with criminal methods. So much for the man. As to the rest of the information that I obtained by looking into the cellar, it seemed at the time meager enough, and yet, when considered by the light of Jardine's statement, it turned out to be the vital important element that I needed. You remember what it was, Jardine? The cellar contained certain objects. They seemed very unilluminating and commonplace, but, according to my invariable custom, I considered them attentively and made a written list of them. Do you remember what they were? Yes, quite well. They were 10 empty cylinders, a spanner, and a packing case. What were the dimensions of the case? Thorndyke interrupted. 7 feet long by 2.5 feet wide and deep. Then there were a couple of waterproof sheets and a quantity of straw. That is a lot, I think. And I'll be hanged if I can see what any of them, excepting the 3 cylinders that were used for my benefit, have to do with the case. Can you, Jervis? I'm afraid I can't, he replied. They are all such very ordinary objects. Ordinary or not, said Thorndyke, there they were, and I made a note of them on principle, which I am continually impressing on my students, that you can never judge in advance what the evidential value of any fact will be, and on further principle that, in estimating evidence, there is no such thing as a commonplace fact or object. Until I heard Jardine's account of the affair, there was not much to be gained by thinking about the possibilities that it presented. There was, however, one point to be settled, and I dealt with it at once. My slight inspection of the works had shown that no business was being carried on in them, and the question was whether they were completely unattended, that is to say, that they had absolutely no tenants occupying the facility, or whether there was some person who had regular access to them. My inquiries resulted, as you know, in the unearthing of the mysterious Mr. Gill, but what his relation to the affair might be, I was not at the moment in a position to judge. Then came our talk of Jardine, from which emerged the fact that the ordinary motives of murder apparently did not exist in this case, and that the crime appeared to have its origin in circumstances that had arisen locally and recently, and on our proceeding to search for the conditions as might conceivably generate an adequate motive, we lighted on a case of cremation. Now, it is my habit, whenever I have to deal with death, which has been followed by cremation, to approach the case with the utmost caution and scrutinize the circumstances most narrowly. For admirable as this method of disposing of the dead regarded from a hypergenic standpoint is, it has the fatal defect of lending itself most perfectly to the more subtle forms of murder, and especially to the administration of poison. By cremation, all traces of the alkaloids, the toxins, and the other organic potions or poisons are utterly destroyed, while of all the metals, the three whose compounds are most commonly employed for criminal purposes are arsenic, antimony, and mercury, all volatilized by heat and would be more or less dissipated during the incineration of the body. It is true that the most elaborate precautions in the form of examination and certification are prescribed and usually taken, I presume, before cremation is performed, but, as every medical jurist knows, precautions taken before the event are useless, for to be effective they have to cover every possible cause of death, which would be impracticable. Hence, as suspicion in case of poisoning commonly does not arise until some time after the death, I always give the closest consideration to the antecedent circumstances in the cases where cremation has been performed. But in this case of Jardine's, it was at once obvious that the circumstances called for the minutest inquiry, and that no inquiry had been made. On that face, or on the face of the case, it was a suspicious one, and the curious incident that Jardine described made it look more suspicious still, and moreover suggested a possible motive for the attempt on his life. Apparently, he had seen, or was believed to have seen, something that he was not desired to see, something that it was not intended that anyone should see. Now, what might that something have been? Apparently, it was connected with the hand, or with the part of the arm adjacent to the hand. I considered the possibilities, and at once they fell into two categories. The something might have been a wound, an injury, a hypodermic needle's mark, something that is to say related to the cause of death, or it might have been a mutilation, a deformity, a finger ring, a tattoo mark, something that is to say related to the identity of the deceased. And it followed that the cremation might have been made use of to conceal either the cause of death or the identity of the body. But all of this was purely speculative. The case looked suspicious, but there was not a particle of positive evidence that anything abnormal had occurred. At this point, Jardine exploded on his second mystery, that of the dead cleric of Hampstead. This gave us at once an adequate motive for getting rid of him, for it had every appearance of a case of murder with successful concealment of the body. And Jardine was the only witness who could testify to it having occurred. On hearing of this, I was for a moment disposed to dismiss the cremation case, to consider that the suspicious elements of it had been magnified by our imaginations in our endeavors to find an explanation of the assault of Jardine. Moreover, since we had a sufficient motive for that assault, the cremation case appeared to be outside the scope of the inquiry. But there was a difficulty. It was now 6 weeks since Jardine had encountered the body in the lane, and during that time he had been entirely unmolested. The assault had occurred on his moving into the new neighborhood, to which he had come unexpectedly and unannounced. Moreover, the assault had been committed by someone or some person who either had access to the factory or was, at least, well acquainted with it, or who therefore seemed to be connected with the new neighborhood. And it was committed within a few days of the cremation. Furthermore, the assault was manifestly premeditated and prepared, but yet the circumstances, namely Jardine's recent and unexpected appearance in the neighborhood, were such as that to make it certain that the crime could have been planned only a day or two before its execution, which again seemed to connect, and that is to connect it with the cremation case rather than with the Hampstead case. There were 2 more points. We have seen that Jardine's would-be murderer was a subtle, ingenious, resourceful one, and cautious villain, but a crime adjusted to the conditions of cremation is exactly such a crime as we should have expected of such a man, whereas the Hampstead crime, assuming it to be a crime, appeared to have been somewhat clumsy of an affair. Though the successful concealment of the body pointed to a person of some capacity, so that the former crime was more congruous with the known personality of the would-be murderer and the latter, the second point was made on further investigation. The day after our consultation, I looked round the neighborhood with the aid of a large-scale map, when I discovered that the yard of the factory in Norton Street backed onto the garden of the Samways house in Gayton Street. This again suggested a connection between the cremation case and the assault of Jardine, and the suggestion was so strong that once more the cremation incident assumed the uppermost place in my mind. I considered the case at length, assuming a crime to have been committed. What was the probable nature of that crime? Now, cremation, as I have said, tends to destroy 2 kinds of evidence, namely, that relating to the cause of death and that relating to the identity of the body. Whence it follows that the 2 crimes which it may have used to conceal the murder and the murderer, and instead used a substitution. To which of these crimes did the evidence point in the present instance? Well, we had the undoubted fact that cremation had been performed pursuant to the expressed wishes of Septimus Maddock, the man who was alleged to have been cremated. But if it was a case of murder, the crime must have been hurriedly planned a few days before the man's death, that is, after the execution of the will, for we could assume that Maddock would not have connived at his own murder, whereas if it was a case of substitution, Maddock himself was probably the actual agent, considering the circumstances. The inexplicable, symptomless illness and the unexpected death of the latter crime was obviously more probable than the former. The illness, in that case, would be a sham illness deliberately planned to prepare the way for the introduction of the substituted body. Moreover, the attendant circumstances were more in favor of substitution than murder. Of the 3 doctors who saw the body, only one had seen the living man, and that one, Batson, was more than a half blind and wholly inattentive and neglectful. For the purpose of substitution, no more perfectly suitable practitioner could have been selected. The identity of the body was taken for granted, naturally enough, I admit, and no verification was even thought of. Then, to Jardine's experience, the hand or wrist is not at all a likely region on which to find either a fatal injury or the trace of a hypodermic needle, whereas it is most important region for the purposes of identification. The hand is highly characteristic in itself, even when normal, and there is no part of the body that is so subject to mutilation or in which mutilations and deformities are so striking, so conspicuous, so characteristic. Lost fingers, stiff fingers, webbed fingers, supernumerary fingers, contracted palm, deformed nails, brachycelia, and numerous other abnormal conditions are not only easily recognized, but since the hand is usually unclothed and visible, their existence will be known to a large number of persons. The evidence, in short, was strongly in favor of substitution as against the murder. If, however, the body which was cremated was not that of Maddock, then it was the body of some other person. That is to say, that the theory of substitution left us with a dead body that was unaccounted for. And since the dead body implies the death of someone, some person, the theory of substitution left us in a death unaccounted for and obviously concealed. That is to say, it raised a strong presumption of murder of some unknown person. And here it seemed that our data came to an end, that we had no matter and no material of matter whatever for forming any hypothesis as to the identity of the person whose dead body we were assuming to have been substituted for that of Septimus Maddock. But while I was turning over the possibilities of the cremation case, the Hampstead case, continued to lurk. And it lurked in the background of my mind, and it was much less hypothetical. There was positive evidence of some weight that a crime had been committed, and the circumstances offered a fully adequate motive for getting rid of Jardine. Thus, it was natural that I should raise the question, was it possible that the two cases could be in any way connected? At first glance, the suggestion looked absolutely wild, but still I considered it at length, and then it looked somewhat less wild. The two cases had this in common, that if a crime had been committed, Jardine was the sole witness. Moreover, the supposition that the two cases were connected and incriminated the same parties greatly intensified the motive for making away with Jardine. But there was another and much stronger point in favor of this view. If we adopted the theory of substitution, it was impossible, on looking at the two cases, to avoid being struck by the very curious converseness of their conditions. In the Hampstead case, we were dealing with a body which had suddenly vanished. No one could say whither. In the Maddock case, we were dealing with a body which had been suddenly appeared. No one could say whence. When I reflected on this very striking appearance of relation, it was inevitable that I should ask myself the question, is it conceivable that these two bodies could have been one in the same? That the body which was cremated could have been the body of that Jardine saw in the lane? Again, at first glance, the question looked absurd. The first body was seen by Jardine more than 6 weeks before the alleged death of Maddock, and the body which he saw at the Samways house was that of a man newly dead, with rigor mortis just beginning. It was indeed barely conceivable that the Hampstead body was not actually dead, and that the man might have lingered alive for 6 weeks, but this suggestion failed to fit the known facts in the two respects. In the first place, the body which Jardine saw in the lane was, from his description, pretty unmistakably a dead body. And, in the second, the sham illness of Maddock and the elaborate leisurely preparations suggest a complete control of the time factor, which would be absent if those preparations were adjusted to the dying man, who might expire at any moment. Rejecting this suggestion, then, the further question arose: is it possible that the body was seen in the lane, could, after an interval of 6 weeks, have been produced in Gayton Street, perfectly fresh, and in a state of incipient rigor mortis? And when the question was thus fairly stated, the answer was obviously in the affirmative. For is it not a matter of common knowledge that the bodies of sheep are habitually brought from New Zealand to London, traversing the whole of the width of the tropics in the voyage, and are delivered after an interval of more than 6 weeks, perfectly fresh, and in a state of incipient rigor mortis? The physical possibility was beyond question, but if physically possible, was such preservation practicable? Well, how are bodies of sheep preserved? By exposing them continuously to intense cold. And how is the intense cold produced? Roughly speaking, by the volatilization of liquefied gas, ammonia, in the case of the sheep. But behold, the very man whom we are suspecting of being the agent of this crime is a man who has a command of large quantities of liquefied gas, and who has hired a mineral water factory for no apparent reason, and put the premises to no apparent use. At this point, Jervis brought his fist down with a bang on the arm of the chair. "Idiot!" he exclaimed. "Ass! Fool! Dolt! Imbecile that I am! With those cylinders staring me in the face, too. Of course, it was that interval of 6 weeks that brought me up short. And yet, I had actually heard Jardine describe the cloud of carbon dioxide snow that fell upon his face. Don't you consider me an absolute donkey, Thorndyke?" "Certainly not," replied Thorndyke. "You happen to miss a link, and, of course, the chain would not hold. It occurs to us all, now and again. But do you see, Jardine, how the stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner? Don't you understand how, when reached this point, there rose before me the picture of that cellar with the commonplace objects that it contained, the case 7 feet by 2.5, so convenient for preserving a body in a bulky packing, the 2 waterproof sheets, so well adapted to holding a mass of carbon dioxide snow in contact with the body, the mass of straw, one of the most perfect non-conductors, so admirably fitted for the use as a protective packing for the frozen body. Yes, a frozen body. And lastly, those 10 empty cylinders, of which 7 had been used for some purpose unknown to us. Let this case be a lesson to you, Jardine, not only in legal medicine, but in clinical medicine too, to take the facts as you find them, relevant or irrelevant, striking or commonplace, note them carefully, and trust them to find their own places in the inductive scheme. It has been a most instructive lesson to me, said I, especially your analysis of reasoning by which you identify the criminal. Said Thorndyke. I didn't know I'd got as far as that. But if the body was preserved in a frozen state, there could not be much doubt as to who had preserved it. Possibly not, Thorndyke agreed, but I had not proved that, had been so yet preserved, but only that it was possible for it to have been, and that the supposition of it having been so preserved was in agreement with the known circumstances of the case. But I must impress upon you that up to this point I was dealing in pure hypothesis. My hypothesis was perfectly sound, perfectly consistent in all its parts, and perfectly congruous with all the facts known. But it did not follow, therefore, that it was true. It was entirely unverified, for hitherto I had not one single item of positive evidence to support it. Nevertheless, the striking agreement between the hypothesis and the known facts encouraged me greatly, and as it was evident that I had now exhausted the material yielded by the cremation incident, I decided to take up the clue at the other end to investigate the details of the Hampstead affair. To this end, I called on Jardine, who very kindly went over the case with me afresh, and here it was that I first came within the hail of positive evidence. On this wall was penned an oil sketch, and on that sketch was a distinct print of a right thumb. It was beautifully clear, for the paint, having been dry on the surface but soft underneath, had taken the impression as sharply as a surface of warm wax. Now, remember, will you, that I took possession of the letter which summoned Jardine to the Mineral Water Works, and I may now say that I tested it most carefully for fingerprints, but the paper is a poor material on which to develop invisible fingerprints, owing to its absorbent nature, and I had very indifferent success. Still, I did not fail entirely. By the combined use of lycopodium powder and photography, I obtained impressions of the parts of 2 fingertips and a portion of a right thumb. They were wretched prints, but yet available for corroboration, since one could see part of the pattern of each, but could make out that the ridge pattern of the thumb of the kind known as twinned loop was. Bearing this fact in mind, you will understand that I was quite interested to find the print on the sketch, also of the right thumb. I had twinned loop patterned. I noted the fact as a coincidence, but of course attached no importance to it until Jardine told me that the artist who painted the sketch habitually worked in gloves, and even then I merely made a mental note that I would ascertain who and what the artist was. I need not go over our examination of the scene of the crime. I need only say that I was deeply interested in the following track along with the body that had been carried, because I was on the lookout for something, and that something was a house or other building in which the body might have been temporarily deposited. My hypothesis seemed to demand such a building, for since the body was quite fresh and rigor mortis was only beginning, when Jardine saw it at Great Gayton Street, it must have been frozen very shortly after death. Now, it obviously could not have been carried from Hampstead to Gayton on a man's back, and alternately, it needed either a vehicle in waiting at the appointed place, and necessarily not far away, or a house or other building to which the body could be taken. But the vehicle would, under the circumstances, be almost impractical. It would hardly have been possible to make an appointment with any exactness as to the time and the presence of a waiting, loitering vehicle, would it? At such an hour. It was about midnight, if you remember. You will remember. Be almost certain to arouse any suspicion and inquiry. On the other hand, a house to which the body could be conveyed would meet the conditions perfectly. When once the body was deposited there, the danger of pursuit would be practically at end, and it would be quite possible to have a supply of the liquid gas ready for use on its arrival. This is assuming long premeditation and very deliberate preparation, as assumption supported by Gill's peculiar tenacity of the factory. I, therefore, kept a sharp lookout for a likely house or building, and as Jardine and I came out of Kenwood by the turnstile, behold, a house which answered the requirements to perfection. It was a solitary house. There was no other house near, and it lay right on the track along which the body had apparently been carried. Instantly, I decided to investigate the recent history of that house and its tenants, but Jardine saved me the trouble. For him, I learned that at the time of the assumed murder, it had been inhabited by the artist whom he had mentioned, but that it had now been empty for a week or two. Here were news we needed indeed. This artist, who habitually wore gloves and whose right thumbprint was a twinned loop, had been living in this house at the time of the assumed murder, but had been living elsewhere at the time of the cremation. It was a striking group of facts, and I eagerly availed myself of the opportunity of looking over the house. At first, the examination was quite barren and disappointing. The man's habits, as shown by a few discarded articles of use or other traces, were of no interest to me, and still less to Jardine, and of traces of his personality there were none. I searched all the rejected canvases and every available scrap of paper in hope of collecting some fresh fingerprints, but without the smallest result. In fact, the examination looked like being an utter failure up to the very last. When we entered the stable loft, there I came upon one or two really significant traces of occupation. The first of these was a smooth, indented line on the floor, as if some heavy metallic object had been dragged along it, with the other rougher lines apparently made by a heavy wooden case. Then there was a quantity of straw, not new straw such as you might expect to find in a stable loft, but straw that had evidently been used for packing. And finally, there was a pair of canvas pliers, which appeared to have been strained by a violent effort to rotate from left to right some hard metallic body, 3/4 of an inch wide, with sharp corners and apparently square in a section. Some body, in fact, that in shape, in size, and apparently in material was identical with the square of the cock on one of the liquid gas bottles, which appeared to have been connected with a screw thread, and had clearly required greater force to turn it with its inadequate appliance. The evidence collected from the loft, suggesting that a large case had been moved in and out and that a gas cylinder had been opened, you will say, was of the flimsiest. And so it was, but the effects of evidence are cumulative. To estimate the value of these observations made in the loft, you must add them to the facts that just obtained concerning the artist himself, the position of the house, and the date on which he vacated it. And these coincidences and these agreements must be added to, or more strictly, multiplied into the body of coincidences and agreements which I have already described. But the evidence collected at the house was the least important of the day's catch. On returning to Jardine's rooms, I ventured to borrow the sketch and took it home with me. And when I compared the thumbprint on it with the photograph of the thumbprint on the letter, employing the excellent method of comparison that is in use at Scotland Yard, there could have been no possible doubt. Disregarding for the movement, the changes, or rather the chances of forgery, that they were the prints on one of the same thumbs. Here, then, at last, I stepped out of the region of mere hypothesis. Here was an item of positive evidence, and one, moreover, of high probative value. It proved beyond any reason of a doubt the existence of some connection between the house on the Heath and the factory in Norton Street, and it established a strong presumption that the artist and the man at the factory were the same person, the weak point in this being the absence of proof that the thumbprint on the painting was made by the artist. And here, Jardine, I would draw your attention to the interesting way in which, when a long train of hypothetical reasoning has at length elicited an actual demonstrable truth, that truth instantly reacts on hypothesis, lifting it as a whole onto an entirely different plane of probability. I may compare the effort to that of a crystal dropped into a supersaturated solution of salt, such as sodium sulfate. So long as it rests, the solution remains clear liquid, but drop it into the minutest crystal of its own salt, and in a few moments the entire liquid has solidified into a mass of crystals. So it was in the present case. In the instant when it became an established fact that the house at Hampstead and the factory in Norton Street had been occupied by the same person, the entire sequence of events which I had hypothetically constructed sprang from the plane of mere conceivability to that of actual probability. It was now more likely than unlikely that the unknown cleric had been murdered, that his body had been conveyed to the artist's house, that it was there, it had been frozen, transferred to the factory, preserved there for some weeks, passed over the wall to Samway's house, and finally cremated under the name Septimus Maddock. All that now remained to be done was the verification and identification of the body. As to the first, I examined the will at Somerset House, and found it, as the American detectives suspected, a mere notification to the New York authorities that Septimus Maddock was dead. I wrote to the detective agency, and in due course came O'Donnell with the answers to my questions, from which we learned for certain that the artist was Septimus Maddock, and that the assumed peculiarity of the hands consisted of brachydactylia. And then came the good Father Humperdinck to enable us to give a name to the body and to furnish us with that unlooked for means of identification. Henceforward, all was plain sailing, with one possible source of failure, the possibility that the bullet might have been subsequently extracted from the body. But this was highly improbable. We knew that the wound had been healed completely, and it was pretty certain that the bullet was lying quietly encysted or embedded in the bone. Still, I will confess that I have never in my life been more relieved than I was when my eyes lighted on that dent in the ilium with the strain and the stain of lead oxide around it. "So I can imagine," said Jervis. "It was a triumph, and you deserved it. I have never known even my revered senior to work out the theory of a crime more neatly or with more or less positive manner to work from. And I suppose you have a pretty clear and connected idea of the actual sequence of events." "I think so," replied Thorndyke, "although much of it is necessarily conjectural. I take it that Maddock, while hiding in Bruges under the name of Burton, made the acquaintance of Reinhardt, and saw in the rich, friendless, eccentric bachelor a suitable subject for a crime which he had probably already considered in general terms. I should think that they were probably somewhat alike in appearance, and that the idea of a personalization of first suggested by the circumstance that they both wore gloves habitually. Maddock will have learned of Reinhardt's intended visit to England and immediately begun his preparations. His scheme, and a most ingenious one it was, I must confess, was clearly to cause Reinhardt to disappear in one locality and produce his body after a considerable interval in another at some distance, and the house on the heath was apparently taken with this object, to be near Reinhardt's haunts. I take it that on the night of the murder, Reinhardt had an appointment to visit him at the house, but that, having learned at Miss Vine's of a sudden illness of brother Bartholomew, he suddenly altered plans and refused to go. Then Maddock, who had probably waited for him on the road, seeing his scheme on the point of being wrecked, walked with him as he was going home and took the risk of killing him in Millfield Lane. The risk was not great, considering the time of night and the solitary character of the place, and the distance from the house was not too great for a strong man, as Maddock seems to have been, to carry the body. Death was almost certainly produced by a stab in the back, and Maddock was probably just about to carry the body away when Destiny, in the form of Jardine, appeared. Then Maddock must have lurked, probably behind the fence, which had a large hole in it, until Jardine went away, when he must have instantly picked up the body, carried it down the lane, pushed it over the fence, detaching the reliquary as he did so, and carried it away to the house, stripped it, and proceeded at once to freeze it, having provided a bottle of gas in the readiness. The next morning he will have gone to Marchmont's office, possibly dressed in Reinhardt's clothes, from thence to Charing Cross, and with Reinhardt's luggage gone straight to Paris, leaving the body packed in an abundance of carbonic acid snow. At Paris he will have made his arrangements with Desiree, and then disappeared, returning in disguise to England to carry out the rest of the plan. And a wonderfully clever plan it was, the most ingeniously and resolutely executed, if it had succeeded. And it was within a hair's breadth of succeeding. The hunted criminal, Maddock, would have been beyond the reach of justice forever, and the fictitious Reinhardt might have lived his life out in luxury and absolute security. As Thorndyke concluded, he rose from his chair and, stepping over to a cabinet, drew from some inner recess a cigar of melancholic complexion and repulsive aspect. Jervis looked at it and chuckled. "Thorndyke's one dissipation," said he. "At the close of every successful case," he proceeds, "as a sort of Thanksgiving ceremony, to funk us out of these chambers with a smoke of Trichinopoly cheroot. But listen, don't light it yet, Thorndyke. Here comes some harmless and inoffensive stranger." Thorndyke paused with the cigar in his fingers. A quick step ascended the stairs, and then came a sharp official rat-a-tat-tat from the little brass knocker. Thorndyke laid the cigar on the mantelpiece and strode over to the door. I saw him take a telegram, open it, glance at the paper, and dismiss the messenger. Then, closing the door, he came back to the fireside with the flimsy paper in his hand. "There, Jardine," said he, laying it on my knee. "There is your order of release." I picked up the paper and read it out loud. "Maddock arrested, Folkestone now in custody, Bow Street. Miller." "That means to say, Thorndyke, that the halter is already around his neck. I think I may light my cigar now." And he did so. There is little more to tell. This has been a history of coincidences, and one more coincidence brings it a little close. The very day on which my formal engagement to Sylvia was made public chanced to be the day on which the execution of Septimus Maddock was described in the papers. On that day, too, the portrait of poor Letty, painted by that skillful and murderous hand, was placed in the handsome ebony frame that I had caused to be made for it. As I write these closing words, it hangs before me, flanked on either side by the little jar of violets that are renewed religiously from day to day by my wife or me. The pale, inscrutable eyes look out on me, her friend whom she loved so faithfully, and who so little merited her love. But as I look into them, the picture fades and shows me the same face, glorified, waxen, pallid, drowsy-eyed, peaceful, and sweet, the dead face of the woman who gave her heart's blood as the price of my ransom, and who was fated to then pass out of my life indeed, but out of my heart's shrine and my most loving remembrance, never. The end. And that, my friends, concludes our novel, A Silent Witness. I found this to be very interesting, almost like a Sherlock Holmes mystery. Very involved, very detailed, very difficult to see around the corner for ourselves as the reader, and difficult to either dream up or predict the next steps in the investigation. I want to thank you all for joining me in this book, and our next book will begin tomorrow night with The Great Gatsby. So until tomorrow, this has been Indiana Holmes. Love to you all.
Please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the notifications button. Thank you very much.